going to fight like hell against the tyrannical Democrats and any Republicans who do deals with them. It will be your peril if you underestimate this movement again.
It's been 4 years, and we're still talking about Donald Trump's concerns that the 2020 election was stolen. A majority of Republican voters certainly seem to think it was. And so you think that the Federal Election Commissioner would do everything in its power to ensure election integrity this time around. Apparently not. Over the weekend, we learned that there are pages of problems in the voting machines that will be used in the November vote. But apparently, it's just too late to do anything about it. In a democracy, trust in the system is nearly as important in the system as the system itself. So the question remains, why does the managerial class care so little for both? I'm Rachel Parker, and you're watching Rachel and the Republic. Hey everyone, welcome back to Rachel and the Republic. I wanted to start by taking a look at this story that I didn't see getting a ton of media attention elsewhere. Probably the bombshell interview between Elon Musk and Donald Trump was what everyone was paying attention to early this week, and understandably so. There was a lot of good tidbits there, but I thought this story was important to mention just because it's something I cover closely here in Canada and Alberta as well. This story was from Politico, released earlier this week. It said that some of the best hackers in the world gathered in Las Vegas over the weekend to try to break into voting machines that will be used in this year's election. And guess what? They found multiple pages worth of problems in the voting machines that will be used. From Friday to Sunday, this event, which happens every year, it's called Voting Village. Their hackers clustered around tables with all shapes and sizes of voting machines and equipment to verify voters' identities or tabulate ballots, trying to get past firewalls or other security measures. And just like every year since the Voting Village began almost a decade ago, attendees found problems. Organizers of the Voting Village intend to put out a full report in the coming weeks detailing the vulnerability findings from the cycle. According to Voting Village co-founder Harris Hertzy, these vulnerabilities ran multiple pages as of Saturday afternoon. And according to Politico, the problem is that those findings will likely come too late to make any fixes before the federal election on November 5th. Now, in order to try to reassure the public, Politico also mentioned that this happens every year, and that every year they find problems. That does very little to reassure me, and it should do absolutely nothing to reassure you. If they're finding problems every year, the question remains, why are they not doing this further in advance of Election Day to try to figure out what the issues are and solve them well in advance of November 5th? Additionally, why are we still using voting machines in elections at all? We used to count the ballots by hand, and we had a lot less problems when we did that, as we'll get into later. Additionally, this also reveals that these problems have been piling up for years, and very little is being done to fix them. Voting Village organizers told Politico that they are frustrated that despite years of security findings, voting machine vendors aren't moving more quickly to make fixes. In a statement, Hertzy told Politico, quote, "There's so much basic stuff that should be happening and is not happening. So yes, I'm worried about things not being fixed, but they haven't been fixed for a long time, and I'm also angry about it." So rather than being reassured that every year they find problems and the election cycle seems to go as normal without issues, what this actually reveals is that some of these problems are being carried over year after year. And those responsible for fixing them, like the vote machine manufacturers, as well as the Federal Election Commission, are doing nothing to fix it. The story goes on to say that there have been no foreign cyber attacks taking wide swaths of voting machine offline on Election Day, or evidence of hacks that affected results, but the risk is always there. The organizer went on to say, "If you don't think this kind of place is running 24/7 in China, Russia, you're kidding yourselves. We are only here for 2.5 days and we find stuff. It would be stupid to assume that the adversaries don't have absolute access to everything." So I think that really sums up the crux of the issue. These are a couple of American hackers who spent a weekend working on this problem, and they found pages worth of problems in voting machines that will be used in the November 5th vote, including some problems that had been found in previous years and weren't fixed. And they're saying that America's adversaries, their foreign adversaries, are working on this around the clock to try to break into these systems. So if they were able to find pages worth of problems in just a few days, you can only imagine what a country like China, who might be spending a year working on these problems, is able to uncover in these voting machines and the sort of havoc that they could wreak if they desire to do so. Now, I just wanted to add one little bit of clarification. In Canada, we do not use voting machines. In Alberta, we do use voting tabulators, which basically counts voting results. But voting machines is a machine that's actually used to record votes in an election without paper. And we'll get into the distinction a little bit more later when I explain what some of the problems actually are. Now, the reason that this is so important is that voting machines have come under a lot of scrutiny in the US since the 2020 election, when Donald Trump said that the election was stolen. He continues to say that he did not have trust in the process. And we know that a majority of Republican voters say that they did not have trust in the process as well. This largely had to do with mail in ballots as well. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, voters were able to send their ballot in, and even if their vote was received past election day but was postmarked on election day, it was still able to be counted in some cases almost as to the Friday. So the election was held on Tuesday, and some states were counting votes on Friday. I think this just reveals that we really have a crumbling system around us. We used to have an election day and we would know the results of the election that night or early into the next morning. And in recent years, it's become more common to accept the fact that it will take days to know the results of the election. Does that sound like a situation that should happen in a free and fair democracy, where it's days to actually know what the results of a democratic election will be? And in this case, it was because states like North Carolina and Georgia, they were continuing to receive these mail-in ballots well past election day, and they were still being counted. And that's, you saw that clip there where they're saying, "Stop the steal." Donald Trump and his office began making calls saying this is not fair. We would like them to stop counting the ballots. We know that the ballots were continued to be counted. This is a story from NPR at the time of the 2020 election. NPR wrote at the time, North Carolina and Georgia, which looked like healthy Trump wins, and then started to shift after midnight. So that was really when we saw some panic begin to set in with Donald Trump and the Republicans. Seemed like they had won the election, and then more ballots continued to come in. But what a surreal thing to read. It seemed like they had won the election, and then after midnight, things began to shift. They continued counting ballots until Friday. We know that Trump did ultimately win North Carolina and Georgia, where a host of the mail-in ballots problems were risen. It ended up going to Biden. So Donald Trump still maintains that he was right to be concerned about the results of the 2020 election. Here's a clip of him talking just about 10 months ago. Take a listen.
Well, I listened to myself. I saw what happened. I watched that election, and I thought the election was over at 10 o'clock in the evening.
You were listening to your instincts.
My instincts are a big part of it. That's been the thing that's gotten me to where I am.
So the truth about voting machines is that they have been littered with problems from the get-go. If we take a look at the history of voting machines in America, they actually began in the late 19th century with a sort of an automatic booth system where you would pull a lever and it would automatically count your vote system. That originally did not have many problems, but as soon as things started to become more updated, more elevated, more electronics involved, that is when real problems began to emerge. First and foremost, with the punch card system that came out in the 1960s. And at the time, it was sort of considered the great innovation. And it was thought that these ballots could be counted by computer. So you would essentially you'd punch a hole in your ballot to who next to the name of who you would choose to vote for. And a computer would then count that based on the punch card where you had punched the hole. Now, that became very problematic in the 2000 election, which was the only American election so far that has been decided by a Supreme Court. Essentially, that race came down to Florida between Al Gore and George Bush. It was so close that it came down to the swing state of Florida. And ultimately, Florida, the count was so close that they had to call a recount. And then the recount was so close that they called a further recount. And it was at this point that they began polling ballots, and they realized that 29,000 ballots were where the hole was punched improperly. 29,000 ballots had the hole punched improperly in Palm Beach County, Florida alone. So just in one county, the machines were not doing an adequate job of being able to count those ballots. And so eventually the Supreme Court decided to uphold Bush's electoral victory, and he became the president, as we know. But many Americans for years maintained their lack of confidence in the system. And of course, the punch card system was no longer used because of the issues that it caused. And so there you already began to see some problems and some fear emerging among Americans that their electoral system, that their democracy was not safe, and that in this case it had been decided by the Supreme Court, with critics arguing that it was simply decided based on party lines. Now, they tried to fix that issue the following year with voting by iPad. In the wake of that horrible recount process, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act of 2020, which mandated higher standards for the voting equipment used in federal elections. States and municipalities spent millions of dollars upgrading their voting equipment. Not all of the new touchscreen voting machines were created equal, and software glitches produced some glaring errors in voting tallies once again. Then, in the 2016 presidential election, electronic voting machines in 21 states were targeted by Russian hackers. As a result, several states have scrapped their expensive touchscreen voting machines and switched back to paper-based ballots. So it just seems in this case, everything that is old is new. Once again, I think that was sort of the comment of the Elon Musk and Donald Trump debacle. Basically, we're going back to the days of listening to the radio. Everyone's crowding around these little machines, listening to two people having a conversation. Of course, it was over X, but seems that everything that was old is new once again. And in this case, certainly it seems that we really just need to go back to paper ballots. People do not trust these voting machines. Now, when I was doing research on this, it says that the Scantron of voting, which is essentially a vote tabulator. So in that case, you enter in your vote and then you put it into a tabulator and it tallies the vote. And the purpose of that is to save time on election night by spitting out the final tallies for a given candidate, and to save that time of manually hand counting the ballots. But we ran into our own fair share of issues with those in Alberta. In Alberta, we do use tabulators. Our Alberta Premier Daniel Smith has promised to get rid of those tabulators. There's been legislation put forward that would do that. But essentially, in our last election, which was last spring, in 2023, we had these tabulators used for the advanced vote anywhere. So you could go to any riding in the province and cast your ballot for your candidate back at home. And then on election night, the tabulators spit out the tallies. However, we had our own issues on election night where results were delayed by hours. Typically in a provincial vote with only about 4 million people, not all those people obviously even eligible to vote, you should have the result of the election fairly quickly, but the results were delayed for hours on election night because volunteers then would receive the paper that was spit out by the tabulator with the tally, and they would have to manually enter everything into a computer that was not connected to the internet. So it actually ended up delaying the process by several hours. And I think in the case of Alberta, many conservatives they don't trust the tabulators. There's a lot of mistrust in technology that has been introduced into elections. So the answer seems fairly straightforward to me. It would obviously be better to end this obsession with electronic voting, with vote tabulators, with voting machines, and simply go back to the good old paper ballot, vote on election day in person, and therefore we have the most trust in the process. I understand that America is an absolutely massive country, far bigger than Canada, but that also just means there's more people who are able to volunteer on election day and to get those votes counted and to ensure election integrity, which is really what separates us from countries where they are not democracies and they don't have free and fair elections. So everyone, that is the topic of the day today. Are you concerned about voting machines? Do you think that it is time to end reliance on technology in our elections and to get back to paper ballots and counting by hand? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. That's everything we have for you today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Rachel in the Republic. I'll be back next week with more content. Have a great weekend and God bless.